You're listening to the audiobook version of The Life of Us We Can't Get Back by Love Kurt on Tumblr and AO3. Warnings for this chapter: alcoholism, symptoms of withdrawal, family matters, pretty much everything we've been dealing with up until this point, but, warnings be warnings, I guess. 5. I long to make this prophecy come true. I long to crack that mirror and be free. I look at my sex, my troubling sex, and wonder how it can be redeemed, how I can save it from the knife. The journey to the grave is already begun. The journey to corruption is already half over. Yet the key to my salvation, which cannot save my body, is hidden in my flesh. Mike shoved the last of his belongings into his duffel bag, the zipper catching before he yanked it closed with more force than necessary. His room looked barren now, even more barren than it had since after he moved to Indianapolis. The last of his posters had been rolled up and bound with rubber bands. All of his books he'd left behind, including some that he'd inadvertently, totally purposefully, stolen from Hawkins High, were shoved into a plastic Tupperware container, the rest of the space taken up by the school break clothes that were left in his closet. Framed photos with the party that he'd forgotten even existed, his binders full of Will's art, and a gooseneck lamp that was small enough to bring along were shoved into a tattered backpack. That was all they could manage in the short time they had. The rest would probably be thrown out as soon as they left the driveway. And Mike couldn't really bring himself to care, because if he thought too hard about it, he'd want to. And then he'd have to make it back to India and find a window of time long enough to... And then... Karen had tried to talk to Mike earlier, but she didn't really get anywhere. Mostly because she was tiptoeing around him, uncharacteristically timid. She had always been so bold with telling Mike the truth as she saw it, through heartfelt speeches and veiled reminders of support, but now it seemed like she was afraid that the wrong word would shatter him. But on the other hand, her silence told Mike all he needed to know about where she stood. She loved Mike, she adored Will, but she needed Ted more, for some reason. So she simply wished Mike safe travels, kissing his cheek and leaving a red-purple tinted lipstick stain on his cheek that he'd rubbed off the second she turned around. Ted, of course, hadn't bothered to say anything. He hadn't even come to the front door when Mike and Will left, his absence a statement in itself that should have provided him some form of relief, but it only set in stone what went down the night before. And even then, despite it all, a flicker of hope remained on the back burner of Mike's mind, and he hated himself for even having it at all. Nancy gave Mike a rather impartial send-off. He figured she was still kind of in shock from the events of the night before. They also hadn't ever been particularly close while growing up. She told him that she was proud of him, and that she'd reach out when she could, offering a few other tidbits of practical advice that drowned out Holly's muffled cries of "please don't go" into Will's shoulder. Mike bit his lip and nodded at Nancy, turning to say goodbye to Nana. She reached up and cupped his face in her hands, pulling him down slightly in order for him to hear her words clearly. She was rather upset as well. "You were going to be just fine," she told him adamantly, and it sounded like she was also trying to reassure herself. "You are a good boy, and I will always support you. You call me any time, honey, even if it's just to chat. That goes for Will, too. Though I gather he has more support, given how his family has always been a bit more open-minded than ours." Mike nodded in agreement, letting out a little huff of a laugh as he glanced sidelong at his boyfriend, who was taking a break from loading the car to hug Holly close to him yet again, rocking her back and forth. "And honey, I know I'm partially responsible for how your father turned out. I wasn't particularly there for him as a child, as a mother should be. I was preoccupied with trying to conform to society's many standards. It was the 50s, a very different time. But please, please know that I never taught him to hate people like you, or anyone for that matter. I guess you can say the world stole him away while I wasn't paying attention. It's not your fault," Mike said. "I mean, for the first half of my life he was all right. At least all he really did was talk when it came to gay people. Will's biological father, though." "Oh, I recall," Nana whispered, likely thinking about all the times she'd encountered a little Will Byers staying the weekend because his parents had gotten into another bad fight about their younger, more feminine son. Mike nodded. "Speaking of, thank you for defending us, for being so... I may be old, Michael," Nana said, "but with age inevitably comes wisdom. And with wisdom comes the strength, too." She leaned in, whispering now. "The strength to not give a hoot." Mike leaned back, feigning offense at her profanity. Nana, I am shocked and appalled. And so you shall be. All right, go help pry your sister off Will before she ties him down with her scarf. It had not gone down well. When Mike finally set his boyfriend free from his little sister's grip, she'd immediately begun clinging to him instead, her arms wrapped tightly around his torso and even wrapping her leg around his. He eventually ceased his attempts to fend her off, kneeling down on the ground so he was looking up at her slightly. Her lower lip trembled, and he grasped her smaller hands in his. I'll come back, Halls, he said, though he wasn't sure if that was even the truth. You don't know that. Holly shook her head, and Mike questioned for a moment if she had read his mind. Tears began to fall down her cheeks, and Mike had to swallow his own emotions as he tried to convince her that everything would work out. I love you so much, sweetie, he said, the nickname throwing both of them off. It just came out, like it was supposed to happen. He pressed on. Just because I'm moving away doesn't mean I love you any less, okay? You'll always be my favorite sister. Holly nodded, and Mike moved his hands to rub up and down her shoulders, calming her down as she continued to sniffle. We have a deal, remember? And you can hold me to it. I left my new phone number in your desk drawer, under your friendship bracelet supplies so Dad wouldn't find it. Call me any time, all right? And I mean that. Any time. Mike wasn't sure what hurt more, the way she still looked at him like he was some sort of role model, or the thought that what transpired over dinner had probably stolen that feeling away from her. Now, standing in the doorway of the house that was no longer his, Mike felt drained, like he'd already run a marathon before the day had even begun. While he'd been packing, Will went to the gas station to refuel and also to get them some coffee, which he handed Mike with a steady hand. Mike's, on the contrary, were shaking, a symptom he didn't know existed until Will mentioned it when they finally reached the basement the night before. The nausea in the car, the shaky hands, the anger that often came out of nowhere, the vomiting, they were all signs of withdrawal. Mike's experiences finally had a name, and it scared the shit out of him. Ready? Will asked, pulling Mike out of his thoughts. He nodded, adjusting the strap of his backpack on his shoulder. He didn't trust himself to say anything out loud. Not until they were at least 15 miles out of Hawkins. Will grabbed his own bag and led the way down the cobblestone path in the front yard. Mike followed, glancing over his shoulder one last time. Karen was standing by the living room window, watching them with an expression Mike couldn't quite read. Maybe worry or regret. He didn't stay long enough to find out. The air outside nipped against Mike's face, but it wasn't enough to snap him out of the haze he was in. Each step away from the house felt heavier than the last. Will must have noticed because he slowed, falling in step beside Mike as they reached his car. Mike hesitated before opening the door, glancing back at the house again. The window blinds shifted slightly diagonally, just enough to tell him someone, he, was watching. Mike, Will said, his voice pulling Mike's attention away from the window. Look at me. He turned to Will, who stepped closer. Without warning, he cupped Mike's face in his hands, pulled him down, and kissed him. Mike dropped his duffel bag onto the pavement, his own hands flying down to Will's waist to pull him closer. Open your mouth for me, Will muttered against Mike's lips. Mike obeyed, and Will made a show of pushing his tongue into Mike's mouth. It was almost as if he wanted Ted to. Oh, shit. Yeah, Mike could get down with this. Mike leaned in harder, guiding Will backwards so his back landed against the side of the car. Will hummed in approval, running his hands through Mike's long hair and pulling. Mike groaned into the kiss and lowered his hands to grab Will's ass. When they finally pulled apart, both of them breathless, Will glanced over Mike's shoulder toward the house, an almost smug smile at his lips. Think you saw that? He asked. Mike glanced back at the window, where the blinds had been pulled shut in a sudden, jerky motion. Oh, he saw. Fuck him, he muttered. Fuck him, Will agreed, still holding Mike's gaze. His thumb brushed gently across Mike's cheekbone. Let's get out of here. Mike nodded, sliding into the passenger seat. As Will started the car, Mike took one last look at the house. He leaned his head against the window, the rumble of the tires vibrating against his right temple. The driveway disappeared behind them, and Mike closed his eyes. The silence in the car stretched on as they drove, filling the space between them like an unwelcome third passenger. Mike watched the blur of trees and houses outside, his breath fogging the window every so often. You okay? Will asked, breaking the silence. Mike didn't look at him. Fine, he said automatically. It was a lie, but he didn't have the energy to think or talk about it. Not here. Not now. Will didn't push, but Mike could feel his eyes flicking toward him every so often. It was both convicting and endearing how concerned Will was for him, but either way it made Mike's skin itch. He knew Will was just trying to help, but right now even that felt like too much. After a while, Will spoke again. "You should eat something. There's a granola bar in the glove compartment." "I'm fine," Mike muttered, not willing to entertain the idea of throwing up. He'd already come close several times, solely from anxiety. "Mike." "I said I'm fine!" Mike shouted, and winced as soon as the words left his mouth, the guilt hitting him immediately. Who the hell even was he anymore? "Shit, I'm sorry," Mike mumbled, rubbing a hand against the back of his neck. "I didn't mean that." Will didn't say anything right away, the silence sending Mike into an instant spiral. "He hates me, he's going to leave me on the side of the road to freeze to death." Mike risked a glance at him, expecting to see hurt or anger, but Will looked strangely calm, his hands steady on the wheel. "It's okay," Will said, "but you should still eat something. Please." Mike sighed and reached over, pulling open the glove compartment and grabbing the granola bar. The wrapper crinkled loudly as he tore it open, taking a small bite without looking at Will. "Happy?" Mike asked, hoping it came off genuine enough to not sound half-assed. "Getting there," Will replied, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "That's promising," Mike thought to himself. "Maybe he'll still love me after all of this is over." He leaned back in his seat, chewing slowly. The granola bar tasted like sawdust and felt like sandpaper as he swallowed it. Seriously, who even gave these the go-ahead to be sold? But he forced himself to finish it. "Thanks," he murmured after a while. Will nodded, his eyes fixed on the road. Always. The silence returned, but this time it felt less suffocating. Mike closed his eyes, letting the sound of wind against the window lull him into something resembling sleep. Will's fingers tightened around the steering wheel as he stared at the cracked pavement of the parking lot. He glanced sideways at Mike, who hadn't moved since they pulled in, his hands resting limply in his lap. His shoulders were hunched, his gaze fixed on some invisible point in the distance. Will cleared his throat. "Are you ready?" Mike let out a humorless laugh. Not in the slightest. Will's heart twisted painfully. He didn't know what to say. What could he say? Mike had just been disowned by his father and cut off from the family he'd endlessly attempted to please. Will knew he couldn't fix that pain, couldn't erase it, but watching Mike carry it alone was unbearable. He shifted in his seat, glancing down at the backpack by his feet. A thought struck him, and he leaned down, unzipping it. "Hold on," he murmured. Mike blinked, his brow furrowing. "What are you doing?" Will didn't answer right away. He rummaged through the bag until he found what he was looking for, a rectangular package wrapped in silver paper. He handed it to Mike. "Here." "What is this?" Mike asked, looking down at the present with wide, confused eyes. "It's your Christmas gift," Will said. "I didn't get the chance to give it to you last night, with everything." Mike's hands trembled slightly as he unwrapped the paper, revealing a hardcover copy of The Object of My Affection by Stephen Macaulay. His breath hitched as he turned it over in his hands, his fingers brushing the familiar cover. "Will," he whispered. "Just open it." Will chuckled at the sight of Mike, who beamed despite having the most puffy, bloodshot eyes he'd possibly ever seen, including his own at times. Mike opened the cover and scanned the title page, his breath catching when he noticed the handwritten message. "Mike, it's good to hear that my book helped you feel better about your own life. I hope yours gets better. You deserve that much and more. All my best, Stephen Macaulay." Mike stared at the words. You went to a signing?" "Me and Nancy," Will admitted. "It was our secret mission. She told me you'd been reading it a lot lately, so we thought, well, you deserve something good. Especially right now." "Will, Mike trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Will reached over, resting a hand on Mike's knee. "Hey," he said. "You don't have to say anything." Mike shook his head quickly. "No, I do." He wiped at his face with his sleeve. "You gave me this during, the worst moment of my life. It's thoughtful and perfect and exactly what I needed, and His voice broke again, and he looked away. "And all I gave you was me, drunk out of my mind, using the Newcastle buyers that Holly and I rebuilt as a fucking hiding place. Exactly what I didn't want it to be ever again. I'm done hiding." Will blinked, startled by Mike's sudden confession. "Mike." "No, I mean it," Mike insisted, voice gaining a shaky edge. "You keep showing up for me, over and over, and I just keep messing up, and—" "Hey, stop," Will said firmly, leaning closer. "You're going through something really, really hard." He paused. "You don't owe me some perfect version of yourself, Mike. I didn't fall in love with you because I thought you'd never mess up. I love you because you mess up. It makes you human." Mike let out a breath, his grip tightening on the book in his hands. "I don't know how you do it," he murmured. "How you still believe in me." "Because I know you," Will said simply. And I know you're not giving yourself enough credit. You're strong, Mike, even if you don't feel like it right now. Mike bit his lip, his face crumpling again. Will reached for his hand, holding it tightly. Listen to me, Will continued, his voice steady but full of emotion. This isn't going to be easy. I know that. But we're going to get through it together. We'll start here with the apartment, and then we can talk next steps. Leave the rest for another day, okay? We just have to get through this one. Mike let out a choked laugh, tears still spilling down his face. How do you always know the right thing to say? Will offered a light smile, squeezing his hand. Because I've been there, and because I love you. Mike exhaled deeply, his body sagging slightly. I love you too, he replied. Will leaned over, pulling Mike into a tight hug. We've got this, he whispered into his ear. Now let's go meet this friend of yours. Mike stepped through the door, his voice loud as he called out, Honey, I'm home! Mike! Will heard Wyatt before he saw him. Then, he appeared in the living room, and Will took in his appearance with a careful lens. He had freshly dyed stop-sign red hair, a blue sweatshirt with the logo for Wyckoff Boys Soccer printed on the front, light-washed skinny jeans that clung to lean legs, and Converse that looked like they'd seen better days. Mike grinned. Hey, stranger. Wyatt looked like he was about to cry as he ran across the room and threw himself into Mike's arms, Mike staggering back a few feet as he caught him. They stood there for a few seconds in silence, and Will watched as Mike's hands ran up and down Wyatt's back, while Wyatt's gripped themselves around Mike's neck a bit too tightly for his personal preference. Don't do that again, Wyatt said as he pulled away. He lowered himself back to the ground from where he'd stood on his tiptoes, crossing his arms in front of his chest and shooting puppy eyes up at Mike. Which part? Mike asked with the tilt of his head, oblivious to the way Wyatt was clearly pouting but in a flirty way. All of it? Wyatt replied, rocking back and forth on his feet. No promises, Mike said as he lifted a hand to the side of Wyatt's face, patting his cheek once, twice. They were certainly close. Will had to remind himself that Wyatt was, after all, a WB. The first of 4, in fact. But he left it alone because, well, Mike had found a new best friend. And that was not something to complain about, considering how Will left that place open following his departure. Mike suddenly spun around on his heels, sprinting over to where Will still hovered in the doorway. I'm so stupid, I forgot to introduce— You're not stupid. Wyatt and Will interrupted at the same time, their voices overlapping. Mike recovered with a small laugh and pulled Will close from behind, so Will's back was pressed against Mike's chest. Will held onto Mike's forearms, feeling the slightest bit cocky when he saw Wyatt's stunned expression. So, Mike said, chin moving against the top of Will's head. This is Will. First friend, first love, the sorcerer himself. Also known as my boyfriend. Isn't he cute? Yeah, that was quite the introduction, Wyatt mused neutrally, extending a hand out for Will to shake. He did, and was surprised at Wyatt's strength. Wyatt's hazel eyes were cold and slightly narrowed. Yeah, seriously, he chuckled awkwardly, slightly intimidated. He tilted his head to look up at Mike upside down from where he stood in his arms. And how would you introduce your friend over here? Mike teased with a smile. This is Wyatt. Niche film enthusiast, professional shit talker, fantastic kisser. Also known as my best friend. He's cute too. Honestly, you guys, my taste in men is— Mike did the motion of a chef's kiss. Perfection. Will laughed incredulously, looking over at Wyatt, who scoffed in irritation and rolled his eyes. Mike pulled his arms off of Will then, moving to stand between Will and Wyatt, who had unintentionally begun a staring, glaring contest. All right, so, where do we start? Bedroom? Will nodded. Sure. Wyatt glanced at Mike, then back at Will. We'll meet you in there, okay? Mike looked a little surprised, but nodded. Okay. He disappeared into the hallway, leaving Wyatt and Will standing in the living room. Wyatt watched Mike go, his face softening slightly. He seems happy. Happier. Will shifted, unsure how to respond. Yeah, I haven't really been caught up on the story in its entirety yet, but— Well? Wyatt interrupted, crossing his arms again. I was there for most of it. Ask away. Will hesitated, but the questions that had been swirling in his mind since he and Mike left Hawkins couldn't be ignored. First of all, the alcohol. When did it start? Wyatt sighed. Before I met him. Was it always this bad? Will asked quietly. Wyatt's expression darkened. Pretty much. I mean, I met him after the phone call happened, though, so— Will's stomach twisted. Phone call? He asked, dreading the possibility of already knowing the answer. When Wyatt raised an eyebrow, that confirmed it for Will. Shit. Yeah. That phone call. Wyatt confirmed. It drove him insane. But from what Mike has told me, he's had a problem since September of '89. Will felt his throat tighten. So, I did this. Yup, Wyatt said bluntly. Fuck, Will muttered. rubbing a hand over his face. Hey, don't sweat it, Wyatt said, thankfully easing up a bit. I tried my best to keep tabs on him while you were gone, so... Will looked up. Thank you. Wyatt shrugged simply. You're welcome. Should we join him back in there? Yeah, Will said, nodding. They found Mike in his bedroom, standing in front of a pile of books with a sheepish expression. Okay, so I just realized I don't have any boxes. I have some in my car, Wyatt said. Be right back. He slipped out of the room, leaving Mike and Will alone. Mike turned to Will, holding out a familiar item of clothing. Here's your sweater. You left it at my house. Will frowned slightly. I did? I don't even remember. Keep it. Mike shook his head. No, you can have it back. It's yours. I have your blue sweatshirt, so call it even. Will smiled. Sure. The room fell quiet as they began organizing books, the only sound the soft rustle of pages and the occasional creak of the floorboards. After a few minutes, Will looked up. Hey, babe. Yeah? Mike asked without looking up. Why is my painting tacked to your ceiling? Mike froze for a moment, his eyes darting to the ceiling. No reason. He used to stare at it and cry himself to sleep every night. Wyatt's voice rang out dryly from the doorway. Mike nearly dropped the book in his hand. Jesus Christ, warn a guy! Sorry, Wyatt said, though he didn't sound particularly apologetic. Will's brow furrowed. Wait, are you serious? Yeah, Wyatt said, leaning casually against the doorframe. Why? That freak you out? Will shook his head quickly. No, it's just... sad. I'm sorry. It's okay. You're here now, aren't you? Mike tried his best to reassure him that it was okay, that the only thing that mattered was that they were together now, but the guilt. Oh, the guilt. It was eating Will alive. I guess, Will muttered. Wyatt pushed off the doorframe. I'd hope so after everything, he said under his breath. Will's head snapped up, and mind already made, grabbed Wyatt by the arm and dragged him out of the room. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Will hissed. Wyatt didn't even flinch. He merely interlocked his fingers, flipping his palms outwards so his knuckles cracked. From what I've noticed, he said coolly, you come to conclusions you've made up in your head and walk out when things get hard. Is that what you really think of me? Well, if the shoe fits, dude, Wyatt replied nonchalantly. You ruined his life. Will felt his hands clenching at his sides but forced himself to take a deep breath. Hey, listen, I know I fucked up, but I'm here now. Yeah, I'm not done. Wyatt, I know you probably hate me, and I know it'll take a while to earn your trust, but we've got to be civil. He just lost his family last night after coming out to them. I don't want him to lose you too. He needs you. Wyatt looked at him up and down for a moment, considering his words. Will felt like he was under a microscope. Wyatt finally sighed in surrender. This doesn't mean I'll ever like you. You don't have to like me, Will said firmly. Hex me for all I care. I've been through worse. Just be civil. Wyatt finished, nodding. Civil, Will repeated, holding Wyatt's gaze. For Mike's sake, they could both manage that. They had to. Epilogue. Anywhere I want, just not home. I don't know if I can do this, Mike whispered, gazing at the garage door in front of him. Even when parked, his hands gripped the steering wheel of his 1988 Honda Accord until his knuckles turned practically translucent, which was not a surprise considering how pale Mike was to begin with. His stomach churned with anxiety, something he hadn't been able to shut off since coming back to Hawkins for the holidays. Everything felt wrong. Mike's heartbeat began to race, and his breathing started to hitch, but then a strong calloused hand met the back of Mike's and pried it off the wheel, and he turned to Will, who was in the passenger seat. Mike, this is my parents we're talking about, he reassured Mike, flipping his large palm over and pushing his thumbs into the muscles in his hand, making Mike go limp at Will's touch. It was absolutely insane how Will always knew what to do. It's going to be fine. But look at my parents, Mike countered, lifting his free hand off the wheel and up into the air before planting it in between the strands of his long hair, which was a mistake as he had tied it back an hour prior. Fuck it. Mike reached back and pulled the elastic out and shoved it around his wrist, shaking his head and letting his knotted curls fall free around his shoulders. His hair was a lost cause. I knew my dad was ignorant, but... Yeah, that was awful, Will muttered in agreement. His eyes were slightly glazed over, likely at the memory of a few nights prior. Neither of them would look back fondly at the events of that night. Christmas at the Wheelers' 1990 TM would need to be fully processed at some point. Beyond awful, Will, Mike lamented, turning in his seat fully and lifting one of his legs up in a 90-degree angle in order to sit more comfortably in his already small car. He leaned his head against the headrest, his bangs falling into his eyes. That was probably the worst coming out I could have ever predicted. Which is why we're going to ease into it this time around, right? Will reminded him, and Mike rolled his eyes. And remember, I'm already out to my mom and dad, and they're fine with me, Will continued, lifting Mike's hand to his mouth to kiss his knuckles. And they already love you. Goddamn Will and his knuckle kissing. Yeah, Mike surrendered. I guess. They sat there for a few seconds, and Mike savored this moment, the singular moment where it was just them, just Mike and Will, sitting in the car, holding hands, against the world, forever. He glanced up at the man in front of him, who broke the silence, much to Mike's disappointment. We can't sit in the driveway forever. We've got to get out of the car at some point, Will told him, and Mike frowned. Yeah, I know. Just... He trailed off, lowering his gaze down to Will's lips. Can I kiss you? You know you never have to ask, Will smiled, and Mike dove in immediately, capturing Will's lips between his own. He lifted a hand up to Will's face, and Will held Mike's hand in place as they kissed. Mike hummed at the sensation of Will's tongue, and Will broke into a toothy grin, effectively breaking the kiss. Okay, we're stalling. Let's go. Mike opened the driver's side door to the harsh December winds, teeth automatically chattering. Being skinny during the winter season was never a good time. He shuffled to the front of the car to meet Will, who pulled him by his hand down the front pathway and up to the door. Before Will could even knock, the door was opening, and Joyce was ripping Will out of Mike's grasp. Will! Gosh, honey, I've missed you! Joyce exclaimed, and wrapped her arms around her youngest son as if she hadn't seen him in a million years. And Mike knew for a fact that Joyce had just been up to Chicago in November, over the weekend of the upside-down anniversary effect. Her eyes, which had been shut tightly while embracing Will, snapped open and landed right on Mike, who gulped. Mike, what a lovely surprise! Joyce cried out, and Will brought a hand up to cover his ear in pain as she released him from her vice-like grip. Mike raised his hand up in an awkward wave, but Joyce wasn't having any of that, as she pulled Mike down into one of those hugs where they'd sway side to side. Will watched in adoration, and Mike gave him the finger. She pulled back, eyes narrowing as he straightened his posture. Have you gotten even taller since I last saw you? Maybe, Mike chuckled, rubbing the base of his neck nervously. I've lost track of my height at this point. Well, don't just stand there and let the cold air in. Come on in. Joyce stepped aside, and Mike followed Will into the living room. Jackets and shoes off. Stay a while. Can I get you two anything? Hot cocoa, maybe? Oh, no thank you, Mike began, but Will cut him off. Yes, please. We'd love some. That sounds amazing. Thanks, Mom. Mike had forgotten how Joyce wouldn't leave them alone until she'd smothered TM, at least a little bit. He smiled to himself for a few seconds until Will vigorously tugged him over to the couch and shoved him down onto it, landing next to Mike not soon after. Will's strength was something Mike had yet to get used to. What the fuck was that for? Mike whispered. Even then, he couldn't help but admire how beautiful Will's lips were. Well, Will whispered back sassily, it just occurred to me that we never formulated a plan to tell them about. Tell them about what? A voice above them asked, and Mike's focus raised from Will's lips to the girl who stood behind the couch. Hey, you! I didn't know you were back yet. Will turned around on his knees on the couch, pulling his sister into a hug. Elle reciprocated the action, glancing over to Mike with a knowing smirk on her face. Hey, Mike. Hey, Elle, Mike replied, and shifted closer to Will so Elle could sit next to him on his other side. Her long hair fell in loose waves around her shoulders, over her fluorescent purple sweater, and into her lap. She probably hadn't cut it since back then. How are you? You seem better, Elle noted, and Mike shrugged. As well as I can be. I'm starting a new book called The Dropout Chronicles of Mike Wheeler, headed to your local Books A Million this January. Oh, you were serious, Elle gasped, and Mike nodded gravely. He didn't want to elaborate upon a series of horrible decisions that led up to his sudden, life-altering downfall, so he went the vague route. Yeah, my circumstances weren't so great, he told her, and she nodded in understanding. She brought one of her arms up and around Mike's shoulders, shifting her body to face the fireplace in front of them. Well, I'm glad something good came out of all this, she smiled. You finally got your heads out of your asses. She whispered the last part. That we did, Mike chuckled, watching with Elle as the fire danced amongst the layered blocks of freshly chopped wood. Wheeler, a gruff voice sent a chill up Mike's spine. On instinct, he stood up and turned towards Hopper, who stood there in an unfamiliar getup of jeans and a reindeer sweater. Chief, Mike stated, and held out his hand to shake, but Hopper ignored his hand and turned for a friendly clap on the shoulder. How are you, son? Mike felt himself freeze, at a loss for words. Hopper had just called Mike son. His own father couldn't even bring himself to look at Mike, but the fucking Hawkins chief of police could refer to Mike as... But at the same time, Hopper still had no idea that Mike was gay. So, in Hopper's eyes, Mike was still normal. And yes, Hopper knew Will was gay, but Mike felt his vision go blurry at the mere thought of Hopper's face when he figured out Mike was also gay and just so happened to be dating his son. What then? Mike forced out, but before he could begin to stutter out something embarrassing, Joyce came to the rescue with 2 gigantic mugs in her hands. Here's your cocoa, boys, she smiled, carefully setting the mugs down on coasters on the coffee table. And I gave you extra marshmallows, Mike, just like you used to ask for when you were kids. Anyway, we were thinking about having a family movie night. What do you think? God. Family movie night. Mike felt his breathing constrict. He wrapped his arms around his chest and fought the tears that brimmed in his eyes, but he couldn't stop them. Hopper had just called him son. Joyce just used the phrase family movie night so fucking casually, referring to the we in the situation as everyone in the room, and by extension, Mike. And he'd never have that. Not from his biological family, at least. He hated the feeling of being unwanted, and by his own parents, no less. Mike, sweetie, are you okay? He snapped out of his thoughts, feeling Joyce's hand on his arm. He looked around, noticing that all eyes were on him. Leave it to Mike fucking Wheeler to cause a scene. Fantastic. Just what he needed. No, it's not you, Miss Byers, I promise. He shook his head quickly, and wrapped his arms around himself a bit tighter before continuing. Something happened. On Christmas. And he couldn't talk anymore. It was like his voice gave out, or his brain simply stopped working. But Will was quick to help him out, wrapping an arm around his waist as he spoke. Mike would have said something about being subtle, but everything was going to shit anyway, so he might as well. Mike looked at the ground in shame. Let's just say Mike's not really welcome at home anymore, Will told his family. There were a few gasps, followed by a beat of silence. Mike stood there, trying to ground himself, trying to absorb whatever comfort Will was conveying through his fingertips. Mike's eyes remained trained on the floor, but watched as a pair of very large reindeer slippers moved until they stood right in front of him. Mike lifted his head to see Hopper, staring at him. The man didn't say a single word. Instead, he opened his arms and pulled Mike into him by the back of his head. Mike took this strange embrace in, unsure of how this was going to go, but from the second Mike's face met Hopper's shoulder and he felt the fatherly embrace he craved but knew he'd never have from his own father, he broke down sobbing. Hopper's other arm wrapped around Mike's back as he continued cradling his head. I've got you, kid. I've got you. It's gonna be okay, he murmured. And Mike cried even harder. He couldn't believe the turn of events this night was taking. Not even an hour before this, Mike had been freaking the fuck out about how Will's parents would react to his identity. Mike gripped onto Hopper's reindeer sweater tightly at the thought. He could barely fathom the fact that he'd ever compared Hopper to Ted. They could not be more different. Even though you're dating yet another one of my children, which we will have to talk about, Hopper continued. And Mike could only let out a wet laugh at that because it was true. But it's gonna be okay, kid. I promise. Were we that obvious? Mike heard from behind him, and Mike pulled away from Hopper so he could address Will directly. William, let's be real here. He deadpanned, and Mike turned to see Will going a little pale. I could sense your bubbly, lovesick giddiness from a mile away. You've been pining over Mike for what, a decade? Dad! Will shrieked, and Elle started giggling. Plus, you two haven't spoken in a year, and now all of a sudden you're getting all cuddly on the couch. I put two and two together, sue me. Hopper lifted his hands up, backing away and heading into the kitchen. Jesus, okay, Will called after him. I didn't know you were keeping such tight tabs on my love life. Hopper laughed from the kitchen before coming back into the living room with a handful of VHS tapes. So, does this mean we have to sleep in separate rooms? Mike hesitated, but Hopper waved his hand at them, the sheer shock nearly knocking Mike to the ground. Just keep the door open 3 inches and we won't have any issues. That's assuming Mike can actually follow directions this time around. Yes, sir, Mike replied, earning a light smack in the arm from Will, who pulled Mike down to kiss him on the cheek before they sat back down on the couch. Hopper knelt down to the VHS player as everyone else got situated around the living room. Mike laced his fingers with Will's. He could get used to this. Alright, so I've got a few choices from Family Video. Captain America, Goodfellas, and It. 2 minutes till the countdown, Joyce announced to everyone over the music. Where is everybody? I want a good picture this year. Jonathan finished setting up his camera on his tripod, turning back to Joyce with furrowed eyebrows. Wait, where's Mike? I'll get him, Will said, leaving the group for a moment and straying into the hallway to see Mike slumped against the wall. He lowered his red Solo cup from his lips, grimacing as he crushed the now empty cup in his hand. That was alcohol, wasn't it? Will asked with a concerned underlying tone in his voice. Yeah, Mike stated, plain and simple. There was no use in lying. We're still 19, Mike, Will pressed, and Mike rolled his eyes. That never stopped Mike from drinking before. And? It's New Year's, don't be a killjoy. Mike looked down at Will, who was glaring at him. Fuck. He didn't mean that. He was drunk though, so he was allowed. But was he really? We'll revisit this, Will told him, pulling Mike by his free hand over to the kitchen, where Mike basketball tossed the cup through the air and into the trash. He was surprised his aim was still intact. Mom wants a photo. I'll take the photo if you need me to, Mike began, but Will turned around, stopping his boyfriend in his tracks. Babe, come on, you're family. Plus, Jonathan just got a new camera with a self-timer. Mike blinked down at Will with hooded eyes. Fancy schmancy, he giggled to himself, and Will sighed as he pulled Mike into his side, making sure he didn't stumble as they posed for the photo. All right, I'm about to set it. Everyone ready? Jonathan called back, and retreated to his spot as the camera's flash blinked. 1, 2, 3. 10 seconds to midnight! Elle whooped, and everyone hurried to gather around the TV for the countdown. Mike side-eyed Will, who smirked back at him, their respective holds on each other tightening as they shifted to face each other. The clock struck 12, and everyone was celebrating around them. But to Mike and Will, everything else around them melted away. It had always been like that with them. Will was Mike's entire world, and Mike was Will's. Happy New Year, baby, Mike told his boyfriend, who grinned back up at him with nothing but love reflected in his eyes. Happy New Year, Mike. I love you. I love you too. As Mike leaned down to kiss Will, he felt optimistic for the first time in a long time. Maybe Hopper was right. Maybe everything would be okay. You've been listening to the audiobook version of The Life of Us We Can't Get Back by Love Kurt on Tumblr and AO3. This is the last installment of this part of the series. All of my works are available on AO3. Do not ask me for more movie, please. Please, please, please.